Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with Lazar Berman. Today is Friday, May 9th, day 581 of the war. Hi, Lazar. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be here.
It is good to have you while we can, because unfortunately, I understand you're going into reserve duty. Unfortunately for me, because I need to find other people for the Friday Focus, but fortunately for our country, obviously. So, Lazar, how long will you be away from us?
It's hard to know because there's a lot of variables that are going to happen in the big world of diplomacy and politics that we can't predict yet. But as of now, it's 3 weeks. So, God willing, I'll be back by the end of the month. And we have plenty of very eloquent and capable Times of Israel reporters to fill in, but hope to be talking to our many listeners, in 3 weeks' time. We can talk about what I've seen and we can talk about some more of the issues that we've been delving into.
Well, we'll definitely miss you and take care of yourself, obviously. And in light of this upcoming reserve duty for you, and also because Israel appears to be at a crossroads, I would like to discuss with you today the Gaza War, past, present, and potentially the future. So we were going to do this when we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic reporter, Lazar Berman. Lazar, ahead of your reserve duty, I would like to just start with the idea that Israel fights its wars based on not a standing army, but on a reserve army. So this is something that's somewhat unique in a way, especially if you consider Israel's prowess, because unlike countries such as the United States, we don't have a professional army, and instead we have a smaller standing army filled with, well, my children, actually, three of them, and other people's children and sons and daughters, and et cetera, et cetera. But also, we bolster these forces always in times of need with reservists. So tell us a little bit about this concept and how it came to be.
Yeah, so I would go back to the early days of the state. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister in the early 50s, showed incredible vision and leadership and went to stay Boker to his house out in the desert and sat and did a personal learning process to take stock of what Israel's security challenges are, what its assets were, and how it can match what strengths it had to the threats facing it. It was very clear to him that Israel would always face a an overwhelming number disadvantage, a manpower disadvantage against its Arab neighbors. You have big countries like Egypt, Syria, Iraq, who at the time all of those were enemy countries, and he understood that Israel would always in a war be facing a manpower problem. There was no way to keep the entire country mobilized, but during a war, he had to get as many at the time it was young men and some middle-aged men out to fight as quickly as possible, which means in peacetime, you would have to have a standing army, which would have to be, as big as they could make it, but you couldn't keep everyone there, because you needed a functioning economy. You couldn't have security, or you really couldn't have a country without a functioning economy. Therefore, you needed people in the working years of their lives to be out there building families, building businesses, making money. When a war would happen, that standing army, their job was to basically hold the lines for 48 hours, which would give the bulk of the army, some 80% of the army, time to get to their bases, to mobilize, and then to get to the front. Once they did that, this reserve force was the offensive arm, actually, of the army. That's what gave Israel its ability to counterpunch, to move very quickly into enemy territory, and to end the war decisively and as quickly as possible. And this is what you saw in wars like 56, 67 within 6 days, and even a war, I think, like 73, the Yom Kippur War. You had the enemies, Syria and Egypt, take the first step, surprise Israel. Israel had a terrible first week, right? You had Egyptian forces coming across the Suez Canal. You had Syrian forces who were able to pour down from the Golan Heights if they wanted to. Once the reserves got mobilized, and there was a sense of where we wanted to use them, Israel was very quickly, within 4 days, able to push into Syria and end the Syrian threat, and then move its limited forces to the south and eventually take the offensive, move into Africa and trap the Egyptian Third Army. But even that war, which was relatively long, we're talking 3 weeks from October 6th when it breaks out to the ceasefire, to the first armistice. So those are short wars, and that is something that guided Israel classically, understanding you cannot keep reservists called up for long periods of time.
I wonder, Laser, before we dive into our analysis of the Gaza war, past, present, and potential future, I wonder if the reservists were kept in a better fighting form than what we've seen in the past, at least a couple decades here in Israel. I'm not saying that those who arrived after October 7th weren't in good shape. What I'm saying is it appears to me that anecdotally, there was somewhat of a slowdown of training, of keeping these forces in really prime condition, working as a unit. As you know, you're an officer in the reservists. You know that these people have to learn how to work together. And so, do you feel like before October 7th there was a bit of a laxity of that happening?
I would, I think you're trying to be gentle there. I would not be gentle at all, and it can go beyond anecdotes. There's evidence. There's very clear evidence that this was the case. Israel moved away from this, what I was describing, this reliance on quick ground forces maneuver, and in the after the very high casualties, over 2,000 casualties in 1973, in the 80s and 90s, started looking for a way around these high casualty ground campaigns. Um, to Israel's luck, the Americans were looking at something similar because they were going to face Soviets who had numerical advantages, and they were trying to figure a way not to have tank on tank battle in Europe. So the Americans and then the Israelis as well said we have a technological advantage over the Soviets and then the Soviet-backed Arab armies, Egypt and Syria, and therefore we should rely on our technological advantage to have some sort of offset to offset their advantages and move warfare into a new area. So that led to an era where the focus was on investing in technology in the intelligence field and then precision strikes from the air. And that's what you start seeing in the 80s, you actually start seeing the first Lebanon war. That's the first signs of it. And then in the 90s against Hezbollah, the campaigns that we keep having against Hamas, these are very focused on Israel's prime services, which is the Air Force and intelligence. And we get to a point where we can, fire a missile through a specific window in a building. We have that precision. Any sort of tank force that Arab enemies have been silly enough to trot out against us would have been annihilated immediately, and they realize that as well, and they start moving away from it. What this means is that there is an underinvestment in the ground forces, and especially the reserves. The reserves are seen as a force that is redundant, irrelevant, these people that are out of shape, and why do we have to train them? At best, they train once a year, and they started closing down units. So you talk to people from Ugda, from Division 252, which has fought all across the Gaza Strip. Um, when they got there after October 7th, these tanks had not been taken care of. Things were just mothballed, and they hadn't trained. They had to basically learn as they were going in the battlefield. So you're exactly right. The reservists who had been looked down upon by the military brass showed that and by the way, the Air Force, right, were the ones who had been invested in, who jumped from their homes without being told to on October 7th. It was the Air Force. The Air Force waited for orders and tried to work in a very orderly fashion as the Air Force does. It was the ground forces, reservists, grabbed guns, got in their cars, threw on their own uniforms, went to the front. And they proved on October 7th that they need to be invested in. They are a key part. And we've seen that throughout the war as well.
Well, I think just to defend the Air Force a little bit, of course, all the pilots who are in the Air Force, a vast number of them are actually reservists. So they're well integrated into the system even before October 7th, as opposed to what you're describing with the ground forces. Wouldn't you agree, Lisa?
Yeah, I'm not. It's not an indictment of the ethics of the Air Force, but the Air Force, given that they fly these very, very expensive, tens of millions of dollars aircraft, and it all has to be very carefully calibrated, so you're not dropping bombs on each other and on your own forces. They work in a very orderly fashion, and it's very centralized from the Kirya. And of course, they wait from orders. You can't just get in your plane and start flying around. But that means,
Exactly.
right. So that means on October 7th, they were less relevant in the early hours of the fight, whereas ground forces, you can grab your gun, understand very quickly what's happening because you're on the ground, whereas pilots need someone on the ground, forward observer to talk to them. There are discussions going on in the Air Force to try to understand, was there an ethical or an operational failure, because they feel like, hey, we could have really done a lot to change what happened on October 7th, and we didn't. Obviously, once the hours went by, they were killing terrorists on the border, right inside the border, and of course, they've done invaluable work. But there is a difference in what you saw in the early hours, and the Air Force is asking itself questions.
Right, definitely all the fighters who still had a uniform they could fit into, grabbed them. All the middle-aged people of my age and around my age, maybe even younger. Anyway, they were grabbing their uniforms, shaking out the mold and putting them on and definitely making their way to the southern border as quickly as possible. So now let's pivot the conversation. Let's first take a short break, and then we're going to pivot the conversation to a bit of an analysis of the Gaza War, past, present, and future.
Israel bonds, the heartbeat of solidarity, the powerhouse of support. When the Israeli-Hamas war hit, Israel bonds stood tall, proving we're more than just an investment, we're a lifeline. Israel bonds pledges to ensure Israel thrives and flourishes. Investing in Israel bonds isn't just a financial move, it's a declaration for resilience, strength, and a better future for Israel. Join us and let solidarity echo through generations.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic reporter, Lazar Berman. Lazar, before you head off into reserve duty yourself, I want to just talk about where we stand right now by looking back, looking at where we are, and looking at the future. And it appears to me that Israel is right now at a bit of a crossroads. We heard from IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir this week that the army is essentially preparing to begin phase 2 of the Gaza plan to destroy Hamas. It really appears that tens of thousands of reservists are being called up, you among them, and that the army is preparing for another big push in Gaza. And in so many ways, it reminds me very much of the beginning of the war, meaning after October 7th, it took the army a bit of time to stage a ground invasion. Obviously, immediately there were airstrikes, as we just described, the Air Force was activated. But it was only until I think October 13th that we started seeing some ground forces in, and the real big ground invasion happened on October 27th, if I'm not mistaken. So it kind of, do you have that sense as well? Do you have a bit of a flashback where people are being called up, being called to the Gaza border, and nothing is yet quite happening? Does it feel like deja vu to you too?
I get your point. It doesn't feel the same because, October 7th, there was this rush and this feeling that everyone wants to contribute and is going to contribute, and we're going to win, within a couple months, and here's our time. Now we're, 19 months later. It's not clear how this is going to end. It's not clear that it's going to end in victory, clear victory on the battlefield. Um, Reservists feel very differently about this. They're tired. This is the sixth, the seventh call up. It is a very different feeling.
Okay, so let's assess the beginning of the war. Let's take our minds back to this October 7th, then the 13th, then the 27th pushes into the war, and describe a little bit about what happened at the first rollout, and then we'll hit the first pause.
Yep. So the beginning of the war, first of all, there was the initial shock. Israel had to decide. It didn't. First of all, had to clear out terrorists from. It took a few days from Israeli territory, It had to get a sense of who's missing and who's not, and that took a while as well. It took much longer. If you read, there were still people that they didn't know if they're hostages, dead, missing. And then it had to figure out how to train all these people and kind of put these units together that hadn't, no one really knew each other in a lot of these reserve units, and draw up a plan for conquering the Gaza Strip. Amazingly, there was no plan in any. I always figured that the IDF would have plans in drawers for fighting, you know, invasion of Bulgaria, taking over Sweden, just everything you could imagine. There's people working on them just in case. There wasn't, but for Gaza, which is the place where we're fighting wars every 2 years, there was nothing, right? There hadn't been an approved plan in the IDF since 2015, which is, almost a decade where we're fighting against Gaza, and there was no plan to even send in ground forces. That emphasizes how far we had even moved away from a willingness, a desire to use our ground forces. So that had to be drawn up. There was that 3-week pause where troops are at the border. There was every desire, if you remember, the society was behind them. Let's go. We're going to, get our hostages back, and we're going to wipe out this Hamas disease. And it took a few weeks, and then finally the troops started moving in. The first phase was Gaza City, and that was seen as kind of the center of power. First of all, it was a place where the best rocket launching teams were, and it was the furthest north, so they had to reach into Israel. So that was it was decided for those reasons to break the Hamas's hold on Gaza City first. The past plans, from a decade ago, would have seen a simultaneous invasion, as military doctrine would indicate, moving very quickly to take the whole Gaza Strip in a couple of weeks, and to throw Hamas totally out of balance and have them surrounded and out of sorts very quickly. That is not what happened. It was a very slow, deliberate, careful move where we were trying to get a sense of, can we still do ground maneuver? What are Hamas's capabilities? What are our own capabilities? And moving behind these D9 bulldozers, there was not enough combat engineers. There wasn't enough of these capabilities that we hadn't invested in. And it was a lot of force and a lot of firepower. We didn't have a lot of intelligence over the years, so we made up for that by using a lot of firepower to basically move into neighborhoods where we didn't have a ton of idea what Hamas had. We didn't know where the hostages were. A lot of firepower to protect the troops and to try to get a sense of what was happening on the battlefield. That was 3 divisions did that, and that took us to the first pause, which was in late November. That pause was to get, actually, if you look at the terms now, it was something like 10 hostages a day for just a pause in the fighting. Didn't have to pull out all the troops or anything. We're getting out 10 hostages a day. Now we're talking about, maybe 8 hostages for a 6-week ceasefire and pulling all the troops out. So the terms were very good back then. I think Hamas was surprised that we actually went in, that we went in with force, and how ferocious the IDF offensive was. But that ended early December, and then we did the next phase, which was Khan Yunis, which I was involved in. If you look at the difference, you had 3 divisions in Gaza City and you only had 1 in Khan Yunis, which means the IDF is getting more targeted, the intelligence is improving, and we're getting confidence in our ability to do this type of warfare. Again, it wasn't especially quick. There wasn't a big emphasis on speed. I think it was a mistake. You can point out a few reasons for this. We didn't want to harm the hostages. We had pressure from the Biden administration, but there was a lot of leeway to move much quicker, especially when we had all that sympathy from the world in the early months. We should have done most of the fighting then. That took us into early February, and then there was this drawdown where they started releasing reservists. It was clear the war isn't over. There were still troops inside Gaza, and then Hamas started to understand that, hey, we've actually survived the height of the Israeli offensive. We're going to survive this thing. What got worse? There was still the city of Rafah to be taken, and then the Biden administration, I think very stupidly, even for its own interest in ending the war and getting the hostages out, started publicly pressuring Israel not to go into Rafah. You had then Vice President Kamala Harris saying that she famously studied the maps, this military genius, and there was no place for the civilians to go. It took a couple of months. It took until May for Netanyahu to actually decide to defy the Biden administration, and very quickly the civilians moved to a humanitarian area. But they could have done that much quicker, and that just slowed it down. It took a few months again in Rafah as Israel was trying to get to another hostage deal. You had, if you remember, Biden presenting this Israeli offer. Everything was moving very slowly, and it really wasn't clear what we were doing in Gaza. There was these accusations of what's called dishdush, which were kind of just churning our wheels in the Gaza Strip and not moving very quickly toward victory. There was a turning point in the war, not in Gaza, but in the north. If you remember, over the summer, there was that terrible incident in Majd al-Shams where a Hezbollah rocket hit a soccer field in a Druze town in the Golan Heights, killed 12 children playing soccer. And Israel basically started moving toward a much more aggressive attitude in the north. They were not able to get the 60,000 residents back to their homes very quickly. It was turned into a political problem for Netanyahu. And they decided on a much more aggressive campaign in the north. There was the famous beeper operation in September, right? The walkie-talkies and the beepers that blew up. The strike that killed Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, killed Safi ad-Din, his deputy, killed the Radwan leadership, and then went in on the ground in a very, very successful operation. We thought going into Lebanon would mean tens of thousands of rockets, killing hundreds of Israeli civilians. Didn't happen. We did what we wanted. It wasn't that aggressive of an operation. It was more of an armed, engineering operation on the border. But we brought Hezbollah to this very humiliating ceasefire in November, and that was quite successful. And then you had the fall of the Assad regime after. So the North was very successful, but still.
Can you, just for a pause right here to discuss this slightly, what you've been talking about, and we talked about the role of the reserve units, and in Gaza throughout most of this time, correct me if I'm wrong, most of it was being accomplished by reserve units. And then we turn to the north, and what type of unit is being used in the north? Are we talking standing army at this point, going in on the ground, or is it still reservists?
It's a mix. There's several, kind of the cutting edge of the standing army, but the bulk is still reservists. You need a lot of soldiers to do this, especially when it wasn't maneuver warfare where we're trying to slice behind enemy positions. We were taking ground, and then we were trying to go house by house, destroying their arms depots, finding their tunnels. And it's slow, manpower intensive work. And that was throughout the whole northern border, which is not that small. So it was these same units that had been in the south. There was a few units like Division 91, which had been sitting on the northern border throughout. Well, everyone else was getting, all the accolades down in Gaza, and you could tell they were kind of like chomping at the bit. And when they finally got to go, that was their time, and they fought very well and aggressively. But yeah, you needed reservists. Absolutely. That was also reservist heavy. And there's certainly been units that have fought in Gaza, gone up north, and gone back south.
And there are units, of course, that fought in Gaza, went to Lebanon, went into Syria, and went into who knows where else that we don't even, we're not able to publicize. But at the same time, Lazar, during this war, of course, new soldiers are being conscripted, new units are being formed, and they're being graduated out of their fighting units. They finish their, basic training, and their, I don't know how you say, imun mitkedem, their advanced training.
Yep.
And is there no release for the reservists at this point? We're still kind of on hold in the north in November, December time. What is happening?
So you're right that the army needs to get back to perpetuating itself. And that means that the height of the war, when we had the opportunity, when we were fully mobilized and we had the opportunity because of what we're given by the international community in the first few months of the war in Gaza, we had to stop doing that. We had to draw down the reserves. Like I said, we also had to send, the Badechad, the officers' school soldiers back to officers' school so there could be officers for the next generation. We had to send the commanders back, and we had to get people training the next, the life continues, the next conscripts. So that also affected the manpower. But there's no release of reserve units. You have new reservists being released from active duty and moving in, filling new squads or new holes here and there. But there was not a general just you're done for the reservists. The understanding was we have to be very intentional about the way we use reservists. So it'd be basically a call up for maybe 6 weeks, a release for a few months, but sometimes it was another 6 weeks of a release and then back. And actually that became very hard because you would be gone for 6 weeks. You would just get back to your business or your studies. You get in the swing of things. or your family life, and then you'd be called up again. And it was really impossible to, and that's what a lot of reservists have lived with over the past year and a half. They're getting better and better at moving these, at drawing these out. But this is, it looks like we're back to where we were before, where people are being called up again, and it's been extended. Instead of 70 days, they're facing 90 days. Now, a lot of people have had their call-ups extended.
And at the same time, of course, the standing army is also being told that they have extra reserve duty immediately after they finish their 2 years and 8 months of requirement duty. So that it's not simple here. It's a very tricky situation, and that brings us to about where we are now. We were just talking about how the North, also in the ground invasion, it was reservists and standing army mixed together. And now, since then, things have been relatively calmer in the North. I would assume fewer troops are needed up there, but they're still needed for sure. And now we're facing a situation right now in present day in which, as I mentioned earlier, tens of thousands of reservists are being called up. And this week, in fact, we could see just lines and lines of cars of these reservists reporting for duty in the staging ground outside the Gaza envelope. So what is happening now, Lazar?
Yeah, so if you're talking about the North, yeah, we don't need as many reservists as we did at the height of the fight in Lebanon. But I think it's notable that the government is not looking to wind down these fights. If we wanted, we could say, Hezbollah is done fighting us for now. Not long term. They still want to destroy us, but they don't want to be fighting us right now because they understand they're at this disadvantage. So, they and the Lebanese government wants us out of Lebanon, but we are insisting on staying in Lebanon and continuing to strike Hezbollah when we want. Then you look at Syria. The Syrian government has no desire to be fighting Israel. Absolutely not. Maybe in the future they do. I'm sure they don't love Israel. Plenty of jihadist elements there. But it's not what they're focused on right now. And they know it's just a terrible idea. But we continue to deepen our involvement there. We not only have the Hermon and a series of bases in this buffer zone, we've told the government your troops cannot come south of Damascus or they're going to face Israeli fire. And we have taken upon ourselves the mantle of the defenders of Syria's Druze. So we see an expanding commitment, not a minimized commitment that's being reduced in Syria, which means a continued demand for manpower, and it could possibly expand in the future. Now, I'm not saying that this is the wrong decision. It makes perfect strategic sense to be doing this, but we have to recognize that this is a strain on an already strained force. And let's talk about something we haven't talked about. While these reservists are going back and while they're leaving their families again and everything, they are all very cognizant that there is a reservoir of manpower that is not being used by this coalition, which is ultra-Orthodox men. Now, I'll also say, usually in these conversations, no one mentions the other reservoir, which is Arab men. Different issue, also complex, but you have two groups of citizens who are not being called upon. It's probably easier to be drafting ultra-Orthodox, but that is very complex in its own right. Maybe we'll talk about that in the future. But when you are being called up and your life is harder in a number of ways, your family life, your business, you're way behind in school, and you see that the government that was in power on October 7th, and I'm not only blaming this government because other previous governments had the same kind of policy or concept, and the government that has extended this war, and there's reasons where they could point at, and they've done well in some areas and gotten a lot of hostages out as well. In order to preserve the coalition, they are really refusing to do any meaningful conscription of the group of the population sector that could really change this burden. I'm sure that that's noticed by everybody, and the question is whether that will affect political choices made in the next election, which is next year already, October 2026. In the past, it hasn't. Certainly opposition figures are going to try to use that. The question is whether reservists, some of whom might be positively inclined toward Netanyahu or toward this coalition, will say that this is a red line and it's going to stop here, and they'll only vote for a coalition that will keep the Haredim out and conscript them.
That is definitely being debated not only in the streets, but it's also being debated in the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee this week. Its head, Yuli Edelstein, is meant to be drafting a new version of the universal conscription law as we speak, essentially. So we'll hear more about that in the future. But Yes, that definitely does point to the future of the Gazan war because, as you said, all the reservists are getting tired. They're losing their pace in terms of their work or their studies. And it is obviously, really obviously, objectively not fair. But where do you see the war itself moving, putting that to the side? And we did see this week that those who were called up did arrive, meaning the percentage of those who were called up and the percentage of those who arrived were really in the high, I don't know, even 80s, 90s. It's not as if people aren't showing up right now. So where do you see the war moving forward, both in terms of the needs for manpower, but also just strategically, because we're hearing kind of conflicting messages in a way.
Yeah, so reservists are going to show up, right? There's this you don't not show up. They're going to show up in high numbers. Again, it gets harder and harder. Since this seems to be a somewhat decisive phase potentially, then more people show up. When it's just, we have another 6 weeks to stand around Philadelphia, then more people. It's not that they're not showing up. It's that they'll have to balance their commitment there with commitments to work. And, maybe this time they won't, but next time they will. And the unit says, okay, we'll make do. It'll just be a little bit harder. But when the time comes, they show up. And it looks like here there's a real commitment because they understand this could be decisive. We are not at the phase right now where Israel has decided we are moving toward what we call Hachra'at Hamas, the battlefield decisive defeat of Hamas. We are still in the phase where we've been since March, since the start of this latest operation, where we are trying to pressure Hamas to accept one more, at least, hostage release deal for an extended ceasefire. We've tried all sorts of ways to pressure them. More soldiers in the Gaza Strip, taking more ground, stopping the entry of new humanitarian aid. Nothing's worked. We are hoping now that there's this window because Donald Trump is coming to the region next week, and hopefully he can apply pressure on Qatar and on other Arab countries to apply pressure on Hamas. I was told this morning that other Arab countries, they all don't want to see this war continue, so therefore and expand, and therefore they are all pressuring Hamas to accept another deal, and that's where we are right now. Right, this is the final show that we are serious. If Hamas doesn't accept this, then we're going to go back to full-on war, and they have a few days to make their decisions. But if they don't, and Trump leaves the region, there's really no other option because we've seen that every other form of pressure doesn't work. The last option is to do what Israel announced, which will be a takeover of the entire Gaza Strip. It'll be different in that Israel will hold on to territory. It'll try to move as much of the population as possible to the south. There'll be a new way to distribute humanitarian aid, hopefully to keep it out of the hands of Hamas. And hopefully this is the final and decisive phase, but that will take a decision by the political echelon that we are going to move toward the defeat of Hamas right now. It'll be if they're going to do that, it will need to be intensive. It'll need to be sharp. There'll be a spike in civilian casualties on the other side. But, short and intensive is better even for the other side than long and drawn out. Imagine if the war had been 2-3 months of very intensive aggressive warfare, and then it was over with Hamas being defeated. It would have been much better in the end for this film.
I think that's something to emphasize for the Gazan population. It would have been a lot better because, of course, they're being displaced over and over. They have no place to turn. The food is scarce. It's just a terrible situation for them as well. And I always wonder how much that is taken into account, not inside Israel exactly, but more in terms of the mediators who are also at the table. I'm talking about, Qatar and Egypt. How much are they taking the suffering of the Gazan people, the civilians, those who are not Hamas? How much is that taken into account, do you think?
It's an interesting question. Maybe I'll be a bit cynical here. Listen, Egypt and Qatar have their own reasons for being mediators here. And listen, if Egypt, these aren't countries that have an ethos of great care for civilians and citizens, right? Their own, I'm saying. It's not like they believe that people have inherent political rights. So if they don't believe that their own citizens have rights to, due process and freedom of speech and all this stuff, and not to be, interrogated in very aggressive ways without any idea of, due process, then why would they believe that Palestinians do? Now, they certainly don't like the fact that Palestinians are suffering. It creates pressure on their own streets, especially in Egypt. But I don't think that's the thing that's driving them, right? Let's not forget that Egypt held the Gaza Strip until 67 and wasn't exactly moving in any direction to develop that area or to create a Palestinian state. So I don't think that's really what's driving them. These are not regimes that believe in individual rights as this overarching principle. But they want to see this thing end. It's not good for anybody. It puts them in very uncomfortable situations. And certainly the street, I think, not the governments, but the street is very sensitive to Palestinian suffering, and that's very salient for them. And it's true around the world as well. I think they react differently to Palestinian suffering than they do to Syrian suffering, than they do to Lebanese or Iraqi suffering. Certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, there's plenty of places where the world could be mobilized, and speak out, and they don't. And they're certainly more sensitive to Palestinian suffering than they are to Israeli suffering, I would say. But that is something that would end quickly if the war is decisive and sharp and ends. It'll be absolutely better for Palestinian civilians and Gazan civilians, and hopefully then we can move towards some sort of rebuilding and a better future without war for Gaza. It's also better for Israelis. Then we can also get back to the positive things that we do in this country. Not that winning a war isn't positive, but war comes with a lot of, it's not a good thing all in all. It's a failure when you find yourself in war. It might be something that's necessary and that is moral to win, but it's not something that you strive to be in that situation. So then we can do more of the, making sure we are building Israeli society as a more just place, that we are contributing to the world, that we are building business and all sorts of innovations in health and things like that. And I think that's what we should be doing. That's what we want to be doing. And that only happens when this government takes an aggressive approach to finishing the war with a victory. I'm fine with that, but it needs to be a decision that we're not going to drag this on forever. And I will also add that as of now, we have support from the White House to do what we want in Gaza. We're starting to see some serious cracks in the relationship. Not that they're turning against us, but they're kind of ignoring us in Washington. We saw that with the Yemen thing. We could see that with Iran, and that could happen in Gaza too. So the longer we wait, the more risk we're creating for ourselves as well.
Lazar, thank you so much for taking the time before you head off to your reserve duty, and I will miss you terribly, as will all of our listeners.
We'll miss you too. I will miss my listeners, and hope to see you on the other side in a couple of weeks.
Take care of yourself, Lazar.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Please check out another installment next week. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. Until next week, shalom.